Hi everyone, my name is Madeline Reinecke, and I'm really excited to get to talk with all of you today about some work I've been doing with Maddie Wilkes and with my advisor, Paul Bloom. So some of you might know who this is. She's an AI named Sophia. She was developed at Hanson Robotics in 2016, and she is my favorite AI for a number of reasons. She was on Jimmy Fallon a couple of times. She is the only AI to have an official title from the United Nations. But I think the most fascinating thing about Sophia is actually the fact that she is a citizen in Saudi Arabia. She received that in 2017. Now, when you hear about this, you might think that it is the most absurd comparison you could possibly make. Putting robots legally and morally on par with humans is just maybe out of the question. And if that is your perspective, you would not be alone in thinking that. In a letter penned by a group of AI experts to the United Nations a few years ago, they warned against this very thing, that because of the kinds of minds that artificial entities have, because they can never be truly autonomous, this means that they are inherently undeserving of this kind of moral consideration. But my collaborators and I are interested in a very specific subset of beliefs, and those are the beliefs of children and what they think about the moral standing of artificial entities. Today's children are growing up with a much closer relationship to technology than any generation before. And there's reason to think, and I'll get into this in the coming slides, there's reason to think that they might have very differing perspectives on the mental life and moral value of artificial intelligence as compared to, say, people in our generation. So some theory that I think is really relevant for this project comes from the new ontological category hypothesis. This comes from Peter Kahn's group. And the idea here is that robots don't really fit nicely into our existing notion of ontological categories. They're not really a natural kind, and they're also not really an artifact. So they fall in this intermediary space, both in terms of their mental life and their moral standing. Another bit of theory that I see as really relevant comes from moral philosophy. This is the idea of the moral circle. One way to think of this is thinking of like a tree trunk, and in the innermost rings of the tree are the entities that have the greatest moral concern. So, for example, we care about the interests that we have as individuals. We care about ourselves. We care about our family and friends, the people who are like us, humanity as a whole, and so on. But you might wonder where AI fall on this continuum. Where does an artificial mind fall relative to other kinds of entities? Some work on this has come out in recent months and years. Very recently, we see a paper from Maddie and her colleagues demonstrating that children seem to have less of a pro-human bias than do adults. So here we have trade-offs between humans and pigs. And in the uppermost bars are children's ratings, and in the lowermost bars are adults' ratings. And basically what this shows is that children are more likely to save 100 pigs at the expense of one human, whereas adults are far more hesitant to make that kind of trade-off. So this suggests that as children age, they're learning to prioritize human moral standing relative to other kinds of entities. And this might be importantly related to their emerging understanding of mental life. So in this paper from Kara Wiseman and colleagues, they find that children actually ascribe more socio-emotional capacities to robots than do adults. So these are abilities like being able to feel happy, being able to feel loved, and so on. So our project brings all of these different elements to bear. Specifically, we're looking at how children think about the moral standing of robots and how this might track with their developing understanding of mental life. So just to quickly outline some of the experiments that I'm going to be going over today. In experiment 1, we asked children about the mental life of AI and whether AI were vulnerable to harm. In a second experiment, we ran the same paradigm with a sample of adults from Amazon Mechanical Turk. And in a third study, we asked about children's beliefs again, but we asked about the moral wrongfulness of a transgression directed towards a robot rather than the harm of the event. So in the first experiment, we had 116 children between the ages of 4 and 13 come into the lab. This was an exploratory experiment, so it's not pre-registered. And we gave participants one of 3 targets to evaluate. So either a human boy, a robot, or a toy bear. And there were 2 phases to the experiment, 2 blocks of items. One block concerned the entity's mental life, and the other concerned vulnerability to harm. So here's what a mental life trial would look like in the robot condition. So this is Drew, he's a robot. Do you think that Drew can stop himself from doing something he shouldn't do? If the child says yes to this, then they get this expanded scale, which comes below. So how much do you think Drew can stop himself from doing something he shouldn't do? A teeny bit, a little bit, or a lot. But if the child says no to the first part of that item, then it just goes on to the next mental capacity. We asked about 8 capacities in this study, binned by agency and experience. This comes from Gray and colleagues' work on the dimensions of mental life and dyadic moral theory. I'm happy to talk more about why we landed on these mental capacities in particular, if anyone's interested. We also asked about whether or not the entity was vulnerable to harm. So we always, in these vignettes, had a boy transgressing as the agent. So it's a boy harming another boy, a boy harming a robot, or a boy harming a toy. And an item would look like this, for example. So how hurt was Drew when called a mean name or pushed to the ground? And we also asked about the intentionality of the agent and whether they deserved punishment, so whether or not they should get in trouble for their action. I'm happy also to talk about these data as well. So for these higher order capacities, here's what we found. We see that children do ascribe higher order capacities to the boy to some degree, more so than the toy bear. Then we actually see an equivalency between the human and the robot target. For experience, we see something a bit different. Again, children seem to distinguish between the experiential abilities of the human and the toy, but here the robot falls kind of in the middle ground, like what you might expect from the new ontological category hypothesis. So not as much as the human, but more so than a toy. And then finally, for harm, we see something very similar again, with the robot falling in this intermediary space between the human and the toy. So here are all of those data plotted together. We see this as providing some evidence for the new ontological category hypothesis, at least on 2 of the 3 metrics that we tested. And it also suggests that children might place robots in both a moral and mental middle ground. For experiment 2, we went to replicate this with a sample of adults on mTurk. Here are those developmental data again. With our sample of adults, we see something a bit different. Here, the robot falls in the intermediary space in terms of higher order capacities. It seems like the robot isn't quite as capable of higher order cognition as we are, but it's distinctively more capable of these abilities than the toy. For experience, though, we see a stark contrast between how adults are thinking about the robot and the toy relative to the human. It just seems like adults are very much in consensus that robots are incapable of this kind of mental life. And we see something similar when evaluating susceptibility to harm. Robots and toys are less vulnerable to harm than the human target. So this suggests that children learn over development to show this adult-like pattern, seeing robots as less vulnerable to harm and as having less experience than the human. This is something that's learned over the course of the lifespan. So now to experiment 3, we return back to a sample of children. These data were collected both in the lab and online during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we ran a sample of children between the ages of 4 and 9 inclusive. So for this study, we provided the same set of targets, but we made it within subjects. So now participants are evaluating the human target, the robot, and the toy bear. And we also asked about moral wrongfulness as opposed to susceptibility to harm. So here we're asking whether or not it was okay or not okay that this transgression occurred. What we see here, I'll just note that on the x-axis now we have age. So what we see here is that as children age, they actually start to ascribe more higher order capacities to the human, and they remain consistent in their ascription of higher order capacities to the robot, and then they begin to diminish their ascription of these capacities to the toy. For experience, we see something similar. Again, the slope moves upwards for the human target. The human has more experiential capacities, but for the robot and the toy bear, these capacities move downward. This is sort of consistent for the toy bear, at least, with typical accounts of anthropomorphization. And then finally, for the moral standing item, we see something similar to what we find for experience. So the human ratings are consistent, but the robot and the toy bear diminish as children aged. So this suggests that children, again, are learning to see robots as having diminished moral standing. We see this as kind of filling in the gaps, the developmental gaps between experiments 1 and 2. And this appears related to how children and adults may be thinking about mental life. So now just to point towards some takeaways, we find some evidence here that children's beliefs about robots are shifting over the course of development, particularly within the moral domain. And we find some evidence both in our child and adult samples for the new ontological category hypothesis. Some future directions that we're currently testing involve examining the validity of children's beliefs regarding particularly the toy bear and the robot. We'd like to confirm using a dictator game whether or not children really are seeing AI as sort of a social and moral other, or if they're kind of playing pretend. And then finally, we're also looking at the flip of the vignettes I've presented today. So when robots commit a transgression, do children and adults believe that the robot is culpable for that event? Do they hold the robot morally responsible? So tying it back to the letter that I brought up at the beginning of the talk from the group of AI experts, I think this letter really nicely captures the adult sentiment towards moral AI. AI just simply aren't like us and really never can be. But when we look to our data from children, we see a very different story, one in which artificial minds are not very apart from us, both in the mental and moral domain. So with that, I'd just like to say thank you so much for listening, and I very much look forward to your thoughts. Thank you.